Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Today we'll be discussing the technical operations evolution, methods, protocols, and products. We have a few people still signing on, so we'll start in about 60 seconds. John, it sounds like they may have finally found you.
Can you hear that?
Yeah.
They're closing in.
For all the attendees out there, we're broadcasting today from my home in Austin, Texas, and John's home in Omaha, Nebraska. And John is broadcasting without electricity this morning. They've had a power outage. So we're challenging ourselves to find a way to make this operate throughout those difficulties.
It's a miracle of modern technology.
It really is. We're almost 2 minutes after the top of the hour, so let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Today we'll be discussing the evolution of technical operations. Today is part 2. We did part 1 last week. Part 2 will discover methods, protocols, and products. The agenda for today includes some housekeeping, some introductions and background, and then we'll get right to a discussion. We may or may not do a demonstration depending upon the situation with John's power by then. A little housekeeping. Today's session will be recorded. We'll send you a link afterwards in case you miss anything or want to share it with a friend. If you're having technical difficulty, please use the chat function to contact the moderator for assistance. You can ask questions anytime using the Q&A panel, at the end during the Q&A session, and obviously just let us know if you'd like to hear more from us and we'll try to reach out to you. I'm one of your hosts, Josh Stevens. I work with Elsewhere Partners. I've been at Itential. Right now, I also serve as Chief Strategy Officer of OpsCompass, which is a leader in the cloud security and compliance space. And John, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm John Grange. I'm co-founder and CTO here at OpsCompass, and kind of an infrastructure guy through and through. Background is in the hosting and web hosting space, so always jazzed to talk about these sorts of IT ops issues.
Today's format is going to feel more like a podcast than a webinar. We aren't going to share much of anything on the screen. So by doing that, it's about listening and not so much watching. So Merry Christmas, you all get some of your time back. You can do emails or Slack or do whatever you need to do, maybe take a walk while you listen. The content will still be very rich, but we've noticed during the pandemic with everybody experiencing Zoom fatigue, that webinars start to feel a little old, little crudgety. And so we're trying this new format where it's mostly audio to give people a break. And without further ado, John, let's dive into the subject matter here. Last week, we talked about tech ops and the evolution of the organizations and the skill sets needed to be successful. I use the word tech ops a lot to mean technical operations as sort of a general term to aggregate all the different types of ops teams within the technology sector. So it could include DevOps or SecOps for security teams, NetOps for networking teams, IT operations, cloud operations, AI operations. It's sort of an ops soup out there right now. And we discussed all this last week. If you missed last week's event, please visit OpsCompass.com, the website for our company, and you can go visit and see what we talked about. But we really spent time last week describing how the organizations have migrated around, have evolved, and sort of moved from independent engineering teams to these consolidated operations teams that lean heavily on automation. Today, we're going to talk more about the methods and technologies. It'll be a little more technical than last week, which was focused on organizational change and skill sets. John, when I got started, it seemed like that your skill sets with a CLI, whether you were on a Cisco router or, on a Sun OS server, we kind of bragged about how good we were with the CLI. Do you remember those days?
Absolutely. It was the age of sort of like the data center hero, right? Go down to the data center, hop on the CLI, save the day.
And save the day. That's exactly right. I can remember sitting at my desk with, 4 to 6 people standing behind me, looking in awe over my shoulder as I, masterfully navigated multiple CLI windows, with routers and servers and switches and firewalls, trying to solve problems in real time and to make changes to real technology out. And one of the things I remember about that is that when you were making large changes, you had to do it very rapidly because you had to do it one by one. So for example, if you were changing a VLAN setting, you had to change it one by one on all the devices that touched that VLAN. If you were changing an access list, the same thing was true. And back then, access lists were built so that if you messed one up, you couldn't just add or delete a line. You had to delete the whole access list, which might be thousands of lines, and then start over again. And so, the CLI, while it was fun and it did make us feel like heroes, being a CLI ninja, while it set you apart in the old days, today it sets you apart in a negative way. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, it's not scalable, and I think the key when you're talking about all these different ops, where IT ops, net ops, the ops has a subtle meaning that's a little bit different than kind of classic operations, and you touched on it before, that continuous aspect. It's about applying these sort of agile principles to these things. So it's continuous, it's automated. It kind of makes the one-off, I'm going to go be a hero and I'm going to go log it, SSH into this Linux server, and I'm going to do some magic and save the day. All that one-off stuff now doesn't work because it kind of doesn't fit into that model of a continuous pipeline of changes and workflows and things like that.
I read a report recently that said that over 70% of network outages and 80% of cloud outages and security faults were caused by configuration error. And configuration errors are much more likely to occur when you're using a CLI versus some sort of an automation tool that has some intelligence within it and can use either AI or even just a validation scheme to make sure that the changes you're making are accurate and correct.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing, go ahead.
I was going to say, the other thing I think that's on the other side of it, if you are a CLI ninja in the cloud and, Azure and AWS, they have their own kind of CLI languages themselves. Your skills are valuable, but it's within the context of kind of the larger unit, the cloud ops team, the IT ops team. So, your kind of, cloud, your AWS CLI kind of ninja status is really useful when you're building those pipelines, but you going off and doing kind of one-offs and being the hero doesn't scale these days. And it's all about that scalability.
Yeah, it's all about scale. And I don't mean to imply that you shouldn't have CLI skills, because there will always be times when you may have to roll your sleeves up and speed along the CLI. But I think the change is that now if those are your only skills, they demonstrate a lack of progression. And the real risk is that the amount of change that we need to do today is dramatic, and the pressure is always on. The pressure is on because we have more load on our clouds, networks, systems than we had before, especially right now when everyone's working from home. Some systems are experiencing just dramatic load. Can you imagine being on the Zoom, operations team and the load that you're experiencing back from, say, February or January to today? I mean, it's tremendous. And not just load, not just the pressure around performance and reliability, but there are hordes of hackers out there that are using this time that they're stuck at home and dealing with this virus to attack all of our infrastructure. And so I think it's very important that we lean on best practice tools to deal with these things. When I was doing IT management at SolarWinds, and I would do teaching a lot. I love to teach. One of the things that I would commonly describe was an old ISO model called the FCAPs model. And the FCAPs model was a way of thinking about holistic management for any IT system. And FCAPs is an acronym that stands for fault, configuration, accounting, performance, and security. And you use that model to make sure that you had all of your bases covered when it came to managing your infrastructure. But that's an antiquated way of looking at things. But I haven't really seen a next generation equivalent. I haven't seen an equivalent that says if you're running your apps in the cloud and you're doing Kubernetes containers and maybe you're using Chef or Puppet to roll out code, like how to make sure that you're fully covered from a visibility and perspective. Any comments on that, John?
So my thing is that I'm not as familiar with FCAPs as you are, but I'm a little bit familiar. But I think that a lot of that is sort of now has to be kind of encapsulated in kind of the well-architected frameworks for each of the clouds, for instance, and their cloud adoption frameworks. Those sort of things get defined as functions that you need to sort of address, whether it be through cloud native tooling or tooling, from a third party or through some other process. So I think it's definitely, it's highly relevant, but nowadays it's cast more as kind of the well-architected best practices of the cloud platforms you're deploying on.
That's really interesting. I wouldn't have thought to compare the well-architected framework, but it's a good comparison, and I think probably even the centers of excellence type methodologies can be applied here and be helpful. But I think that because cloud computing is still relatively new, most of these frameworks and best practices are oriented around operations in terms of how you deploy code, how you deploy changes, but not necessarily around how do you ensure that you have full visibility of security, of configuration, of billing data. One of the things that OpsCompass does really well is it not only manages drift of your configurations for compliance and security, but it also monitors changes that will affect billing and cost structure. And if you make a bad change, if you're used to CLI to make some changes in your cloud without some sort of automated validation that may negatively impact your cost, if you don't catch that quickly, you can see those costs skyrocket, and you may not know until you get your bill the next month.
It's sort of visibility is kind of at the core of it all, right? All those different disciplines, DevOps, SecOps, NetOps, it all kind of requires that you are keeping track of kind of all of these configurations across your cloud. That's kind of one of the pressures that's put on these teams. It's not just the pressure for performance and things like that. There's information overload, and you've got to be able to make sense of it.
It's really interesting. Maybe what we should think about building and beginning to build a webinar series is sort of a methodology to replace FCAPs, but focus on cloud visibility and observability and the areas that you need to be focused on. Because I think it is confusing for people when there are choices out there from a New Relic to a Datadog, to Chef and Puppet, to SaltStack, to an OpsCompass, to an iTential. How do you know? How do you know whether to use a SolarWinds or a New Relic? And I think that those frameworks could be the key. And visibility is so important in today's organizations. The other thing that's really changed a lot since the traditional management IT operations era is that management protocols are leveraged differently. And, a generation ago, agents were sort of a dirty word. We all tried our very best to avoid installing agents on our systems at all costs. And so we would use native protocols like SNMP or ICMP or WMI or Telnet as a way to try to avoid having to install an agent to gain visibility. But the moment that you put your apps and your infrastructure in the cloud, you no longer have access to the infrastructure that could passively observe the traffic going in between your servers, for example. And so, the agent era was sort of reborn. And now it's pretty common for us to have agents on our compute nodes in the cloud because it's one of the better ways to get visibility.
Yeah, and it's the agent thing is difficult because in one sense, you know, uh, you start to see customers all the time that have so many agents running on their virtual machines, including the cloud agents, because Azure and AWS they run their own agents on your machine. So they're trying to they're trying to cut down on that. But to me, the tough part is in the cloud, for instance, it's a different ballgame because ICMP, for instance, is blocked. You have to actually go take an action to go make sure that it's opened up, and Telnet is blocked, and a lot of these there's end-to-end encryption. So you can't really your packet capturing solutions aren't there. So it's kind of a rethink of how we even kind of ascertain the information that we were getting with some of these solutions before, agentless or not. It almost doesn't matter because it is such a different paradigm shift. But these agent-based solutions are starting in one place where you're seeing kind of a resurgence is the container world, because these container platforms are all running on Linux machines that have an OS running, and they can run an agent, and they can do all sorts of fancy solutions there. So it's interesting. I think it's very much in flux.
I met a gentleman a couple of years ago at AWS reInvent, and he was running a company. He was CEO and founder, but he was also a coder. He built the product, and it was sort of a next-gen voice over IP solution that was cloud-based. Sort of a precursor to a RingCentral or a Zoom maybe. And the problem he was having was that he was experiencing high amounts of packet loss and unpredictable levels of jitter within the cloud infrastructure, within AWS. And at the time, there was really no way for him to get visibility to try to remedy the situation. Sometimes it would work flawlessly, and sometimes it would hardly work at all. And he was extremely frustrated because, the infrastructure within the cloud was so immature that manageability and observability weren't the focus. And that tends to be how all these technologies evolve. When you're building a new technology platform, first you think about features and operational capabilities, and then you think about performance, and then you probably think about security next, and very last you think about observability. And we've seen that over and over and over and over within Azure and Office 365 right now. They're on that life cycle. They have launched all the features that people want. It's very popular. They've made it perform. I'd say right now they're mostly focused on performance. It's getting better and better and better. They still have an immature security model, and the observability is last on the list. And what's nice about today's era is that the providers and the platforms have been around long enough that they're starting to pay attention and invest in observability. And that causes us to enter the age of the API. And using APIs for management is dramatically more helpful, more scalable, and more flexible than using traditional management protocols. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, yeah, you can kind of take a lot of the polling, kind of polling SNMP and things like that out of your life, and you're now dealing with infrastructure that's declarative, right? So you kind of have a more consistent idea of what's supposed to be out there, and when you want to change it, you declare, what the change looks like. And with that, and combined with the fact that you, instead of polling, you can hit an API endpoint and get net flow logs, for instance. That ends up being a pretty powerful thing, but it's a totally kind of different way to think about it than before, where you kind of had line of sight into a part of the network, and you could capture packets and interrogate packets and things like that. This is much more about, you can capture most of your telemetry over an API, and that means that you can now integrate it into other things you're doing. So I think it's really cool, and I think that it's a lot easier to do most things that we used to do even back in the day. It's just a totally different approach.
It is, but I think what I like about it is it's not a manual approach of fingers on keyboards, like a CLI. Or even packet traces in the old days. it's an approach that allows you to use tools that help you scale and help exemplify and exaggerate your skill set. And so for me, you know, an API with a nice Swagger interface that's easy to interpret and understand just offers tremendous amount of flexibility. And it's also easier for the vendors to extend those APIs over time. It's easier for the vendor to set limits on the APIs as to how often they can be queried, so as to not allow the management system to negatively impact performance.
Well,
as we think about,
well, let's be honest. Let's be honest. Then most of these kind of services in the cloud are really APIs anyway. I mean, they put a GUI, they offer up a GUI interface through their portal, but I mean, it's largely, the clouds are largely big collections of APIs that we customers love to leverage.
Well, and I think that that's the key, right? Is that that is part of what's driving the evolution in the skill sets that we discussed last week. Because if your skill sets are all GUI related, they're all higher level engineering without any level of coding capability, even, you know, Python scripts, then it's very difficult to leverage these APIs. And so you have to have not only the deep background to understand the infrastructure and the fundamentals of whatever technology you're using, whether it be network or security or compute, but you also have to have the ability to, you know, through some sort of a programming language, access and interact with these APIs. And manageability, to me, is one of the key indicators of product evolution. You know, and manageability and observability are probably synonymous at this point. We see the term observability a lot right now, and between that and visibility, for whatever reason, the analysts and the marketers out there have decided to grab onto those terms and lean in. But for me, that is one of the things to think about as you select a cloud type. You know, if you're evaluating Azure versus AWS versus Google, many people will evaluate cost and availability of specific features, you know, maybe tech support levels or their own comfort working within that cloud. But you would be in an advantage if you would also consider the observability and visibility of those clouds, because ultimately that will determine how effective you can be at managing and operating the infrastructure.
And you know what makes that right there is what makes multi-cloud kind of one of the challenges, is that each of the clouds kind of have their own governance fabric, meaning their APIs that give you things like, you know, lists of the resources you have and all of these things you need to manage a cloud. These are all, it's different in each cloud. So not only are you having to now think about these cloud services more as an API, but you've got 2 of them or 3 of them or 4 of them that you have to worry about. So again, it's kind of that scale mindset where we used to sort of obsess about, you know, endpoints and like an endpoint or 2 in a data center. And now there's no more kind of single hub and spoke. You've got all of these things all over the place. So it's I think you characterized it right. It's kind of a lot of the same skills and instincts, but applied sort of at this scale and as part of this kind of agile operational process that's completely different.
Well, and because there are no RFCs or IEEE standards around manageability and or observability yet, like you said, the APIs are very different between those tools and between those products, those platforms. And I think for me, what that says is that it's very difficult if you're working within an organization and you're operating infrastructure. It's difficult to write your own tools or to even leverage open source tools that you have to customize, because it's so much work to maintain and update the product to take advantage of all of the APIs from each individual player. Not only that, but you know, Azure, Microsoft, Amazon, and Google are very acquisition hungry. And so as they acquire technologies to integrate into their cloud platforms, those technologies usually have their own APIs. And those APIs don't follow a standard that the acquiring company has written or posted anywhere. And so you end up in this environment where you've got multiple APIs within each cloud platform, And those APIs are very different from the APIs of the other cloud platforms. And that drives the viability of products like OpsCompass and a few others we'll discuss in a minute, because for me at least, it's more effective to let the vendors, the companies that are focused on building these tools as a business, let them spend the time to know the APIs, let them deal with those complexities, and instead focus your time on operating your cloud and your applications.
Yeah, and on a lot of these things that customers think are just, and they're rightly so, are just kind of core to a cloud service, these things like backups and being able to capture an inventory and know when this or that thing happened. It's not that it's the cloud providers say, yeah, that's totally, you can definitely do that on our platform. And what I think the customers don't quite understand is that in the modern context, in today's world, you can do it through the APIs. That means that you as a customer now have to stand up some sort of, whether it's a dashboard or some application, you're maintaining it, you've got to connect to these other clouds. So it's I think with a lot of these tools, OpsCompass included, it's not necessarily, you're in a lot of ways sort of augmenting and helping the customers leverage a lot of these APIs. And the customers don't always think about it that way because they're still kind of getting that, kind of changing the mindset from the on-prem data center world to the cloud world.
I think that's a really great point, John. Observability is determined by the builders of the object of your focus. So, observability is something that Amazon or Google or Oracle or whomever you're managing, Microsoft, they have to think about. Observability is determined by the quality of their APIs and how they've implemented them. But visibility is what you gain or what you enable through your intelligent management strategy by using best practice tools that are able to access those APIs. And this is one of the most challenging areas I think that we have to deal with. When we used SNMP or even agents, then you knew that you had a standard way of doing things across any vendor, right? If I'm using a specific, RFC 1213 MIB to query data from a Cisco router, I can use that same SNMP MIB to query a Juniper router or a Checkpoint firewall or a Palo Alto device because it's a standard. With APIs, it's not like that. And I think one of the challenges, which is sort of like a double-edged sword, is that if you have chosen a high-quality tool, like an OpsCompass, then they will abstract those APIs in such a way that to you as a user, it will probably look as if Azure, AWS, and Google or GCP have the same observability level and the same APIs and a standard way of doing it, because the management vendor, if they do it right, will focus on sort of leveling the playing field and giving you a standard way of thinking about and doing management, so that it almost doesn't matter if you're dealing with Google's cloud platform versus Amazon's. But it's a challenge, and I think it drives up engineering costs for companies like ours. I think it drives up the delay of when the observability of a new feature released by one of those cloud providers can be integrated into a management product. But what I love about what's happening right now is that all of the providers are investing heavily in enriching their APIs, because observability has become one of the key areas that we use to evaluate not just their maturity, but their readiness for a real enterprise application, with customers accessing it from across the world.
I think one of the things that also companies don't quite appreciate when they're talking about maybe rolling their own kind of ops, telemetry ingestion, governance, security compliance, all that stuff, they the level of people that you now have to hire to maintain that and even run it ends up being a whole different kind of type of person. And think about today's environment, the current times. I don't know about you, Josh, but I don't hear a lot of companies, adding a lot of people to their IT staffs. So you start thinking about, using the skills that you have on your team, being able to pivot more to the cloud, those sorts of things. Doing all that kind of high level integration ends up being a huge leap when you can really start to leverage a lot of the efficiency of the cloud and maybe not have to have those sorts of horses. Because even for a company like us, all we do is build software that's integrated into the cloud. We have to hire people from all over the place to find the people that really know the ins and outs of those platforms. And I think for lots of companies, that's either not an option or super difficult.
That's a really interesting point, John. I think you're absolutely right that that's one of the challenges. And what I see is, well, first of all, let me back up. I think the term IT is one that can be misused a lot. And for me, I sometimes get almost offended when someone says I'm in IT, because IT to me seems like back office. It seems like email and Microsoft Office and printing and all of those things. And those are valid skill sets, and they're certainly very important. But in many cases now, organizations outsource that to an MSP or to some other provider. And as an engineer, many of us use those skills as a stepping stone to go up and learn. We might start in IT on laptops, on desktop support, and doing antivirus, and continue to advance. But the technology that drives revenue for these companies, the technology that their customers interact with, is less likely to be outsourced or handled by anyone from outside the organization. And those teams will likely be labeled as DevOps or NetOps or IT operations or cloud engineering. And it's a very, very different dynamic. And it is also, a level of skills that demand a much higher level of compensation. Hiring skilled cloud engineers right now is very, very expensive. And it's because that it's in super high demand. It's complex, and it requires you to stay on your education, because the knowledge changes over time. I mean, these technologies are still brand new. I mean, they're just toddlers in terms of their advancement of where they're going to be in a few years.
And the biggest companies, most companies still haven't done a lot there yet. So you're almost lucky. You can consider yourself lucky if you've been working at an organization that has been able to expose you to some of those cloud services, because it's hard to find anybody who's even worked with any of these things, particularly some of the newer things on, say, GCP.
Yeah, I completely agree. Let's talk a little bit about some products. We've discussed protocols and management methodologies. And this may feel like a sales pitch, but what I want to do is describe some products that OpsCompass doesn't sell, that we consider best practices in the industry, and then talk a little bit about OpsCompass. When it comes to network operations or NetOps, network automation is one of those areas that has been very, very difficult and slow to be adopted. I think that's because people are reluctant to automate change on core infrastructure. If you mess up a change that you roll out to your whole network, it can be disastrous, much worse than changing a setting on a server or an app, And I have personally made changes, on routers and switches that I've had to put people on airplanes to fly out to fix, because, it changed the reachability of those devices, and that part of the network was isolated. And so network automation and network ops can be difficult. So you need to be very, very careful about what tool you use. A lot of people out there use Ansible to do network automation. It's Python based. You can use Tower to sort of manage that. Another great product that's out there is called Itential. And Itential is a network automation platform that's geared toward networks that require high speed, really robust change automation, specifically the larger networks. And so if you're out there looking for a network automation tool, check out Itential. I know those guys pretty well. It's really a spectacular product. Another area that you have to think about when it comes to automation is, how you're going to monitor change and detect new errors that are induced from that change. Not only through error management and logging, but through performance monitoring as well, through APM. And a great company for doing that is a company called Airbrake. They're based out of San Francisco. They have engineers all over the place. But their real focus is providing that observability through deep visibility into changes within your code that you push out through your CI/CD process, and then making it easy when new errors are induced to use a breadcrumb trail to track that back through the CI/CD process, through a check-in, to see which person made the change at what time on what machine, and should we put it back or not. When you can get that level of analysis and tracking on changes that induce errors, and combine that with APM for visibility on performance, then it really mitigates a lot of the things that happen with changes that might induce problems in the app infrastructure. Last but not least, cloud security, visibility, enablement, and compliance are key right now. And it's an area that is very difficult to do without some sort of a high-end tool to do it for you. And OpsCompass, it has been the best product I've seen for doing that. I met OpsCompass in November of last year, and I wasn't exactly sure, what the product did and how it was oriented. But after a demonstration, I was hooked. I was hooked, as a technologist. I was hooked as an investor. I was hooked as a fan now. John, maybe since we have some time, you could spend just a moment talking about what OpsCompass does and how it fits into this management paradigm.
Sure. OpsCompass is really about that, exactly kind of what we've been talking about here, which is that visibility. Underlying all these things in the cloud where everything's software defined, you kind of have to have visibility into how things are configured right now, so that when they change, you can compare and you can keep track of things. So OpsCompass is all about taking this idea that you have all these clouds and all these things going on, and they're inevitably, those configurations are going to drift. And OpsCompass helps you detect those drifts, but not just kind of show you an event that happened, which is, really common kind of in the last generation of tools, because, everything was built around kind of log-based solutions and they were really good. In the cloud, you sometimes will have an action taken on a cloud service that might be composed of a whole bunch of different resources. And you also might have people that are on the IT ops team that maybe don't have tons of deep experience in each of the clouds. And you want to be able to have visibility into something that happened and be able to make sense of it, and be able to maybe bring those composite resources together and have that kind of keen visibility into how is this thing drifting. So OpsCompass really is all about that kind of drift detection. And then since we know what everything looks like, we can do compliance analysis and overall kind of help maintain and enforce this overall management baseline across all their clouds.
Drift is such an important term in today's ecosystems, because it's easy to understand that if you make a change and that single change induces a vulnerability or a performance issue or some unanticipated cost, repercussion, that's a pretty standard way of understanding how configs can go bad. But drift is a whole different animal. Drift is about, it's a leaky bucket situation. It's about small changes over time that in aggregate move you out of best practices, move you out of being highly secure or compliant, that move you into a situation where you're blowing your budgets way out and you can't figure out why things aren't going right. And the longer that you let drift continue to accelerate, it's like this giant snowball heading down a mountain, and the drift just continues to get worse and worse and worse. And both iTential on the network side and OpsCompass on the cloud side do such an elegant job of detecting and managing that drift that for me, it's very hard to imagine operating those types of infrastructure without a tool like that. And I think for me, that's really what sold me on it. Because as a cloud engineer, when I'm asked by a CEO or a CIO, whether or not we're more secure or less secure than this time last quarter or this time last month, how are we trending from a compliance standpoint? How are we managing costs? It's a really difficult question to answer because those things aren't binary. You can't check a box and say, oh, we're either secure or we aren't. We're either compliant or we aren't. We're either doing the best we can to manage cost or we aren't. Because there's wiggle room all over the place in those categories. And so much of that analysis is subjective that I think you really need a product that provides that baseline and that analysis. And of the customers I've spoken with, especially on the OpsCompass side, that's one of the things that they really love, is that it saves them a tremendous amount of time. Many customers have told me it saves them the equivalent of 3 or 4 full-time resources. And it allows you at a glance to have both the visibility you would want to give an executive a summary, of how things are trending. And if you drill down, it gives you the detailed analysis that allows you to see what changes you should make to correct that drift. And for those people out there that haven't checked it out, if you're managing this type of infrastructure, if you're a cloud engineer or a DevOps resource, and you don't use something like OpsCompass, check it out. There's a free version on the website you can check out. It's a trial. But use something. Use that or something else similar. Don't just operate the cloud, in this bare-naked environment without that visibility. Without observability, you're just flying in the dark, and it's very, very difficult to predict when you may be attacked or when those vulnerabilities may cause an outage. And right now is not the time to be in the news because you got hacked or you were down for 3 hours or something like that. The competition is fierce. We're all working from home, and operations is harder right now. Most operations teams, a year ago were in large rooms with many large LCD screens up on the walls with dashboards, and you sat shoulder to shoulder with your friends who were also engineers, and you collaborated and troubleshooted these problems together. Now that we're all at home, observability is even more important, and ensuring that you have visibility that makes it easy to tell where you have drift issues, whether you're at home or in the office or in a data center, is paramount to your success.
Yeah, I mean, think about this. Like, if you're a dev team and you're responding to the business, you've got to get more performance. And so you need to add, let's say, a Kubernetes node, scale up a new Kubernetes node. You're no longer in the office. Like you've got to assign a bunch of IPs to that node. You got to be able to interface with that network team to make sure that you're not going to overlap with ranges that you're using maybe in another cloud or another data center on-prem. Like the cloud stuff doesn't preclude the importance of network people. And you're right. Like in this kind of remote working environment, there's a lot of this kind of key communication that needs to happen to make visibility really work. And it's harder to do. It's harder for everybody to do.
Yeah, I completely agree. I want to thank everyone for attending today. It's been a great webinar. We'll be doing more of these in the future. Give us some feedback on the format. Hopefully this allows you to catch up on some emails or get some work done. John, any last closing remarks or comments?
No, this has been fun. I encourage feedback from any listeners, and excited to do more. I like kind of these deeper, a little bit nerdier ones, Josh.
Yeah, it's funny. I still feel like we're just scratching the surface, of some of these topics, but we can get there over time together. And hopefully this series will continue to evolve for everyone out there, because all of us that are in today's tech ops teams, we're dealing with challenges that haven't been seen before. We're dealing with environments that have never occurred before. Never in the history of the earth has there been a DevOps team who had to deal with a pandemic. During the time of the Spanish flu, they weren't working with Kubernetes. They were worried about their horses out in the yard and how they could, get their wheat harvested. It's a new situation, and it requires adaptive reasoning. It requires evolution of skill sets and tools, and we're here together to do that. And so I think the key is, I believe that tech ops teams and tech ops members are some of the most underappreciated people in the industry. And I appreciate you, and I know that your customers do. So without further ado, let's go ahead and close this one out. Thank you everyone for attending. Check out OpsCompass.com. We'll be posting the recorded version and we'll be announcing more events soon. Thank you very much, John.
Thanks, man.